Last time on Bleach, Thousand-Year Blood War: The Conflict. A brutal showdown between the head captain of the 13 court guard squads, Kyoraku Shunsui, and Stern Ritter X, Lil Baro commenced. After narrowly evading Kyoraku's Budhid Harma game attacks, Baro transforms into an ascended Quincy state called Zilio, which quickly turns the tables on Kyoraku. But Kyoraku counters with his deadly Bankai, which progressively deals more and more damage to Baro until eventually his head explodes and the battle is settled. Has Baro finally been defeated? And what is it that Kyoraku has to tell Oshana? Stay tuned to find out in Episode 10. Episode 10 starts off with Pernida bursting out of Ashisajijizo, blowing it to smithereens. Pernida now has a bow and arrow in his hand, as he once again reminds Kurotsuchi that he was a Quincy. Kurotsuchi, however, mocks him for claiming to be a Quincy despite being the mighty Soul King's left arm. Pernida doesn't appreciate insults on the Quincy name from Kurotsuchi. However, his voice changes in between this. Kurotsuchi picks up on this as well, speculating if that perhaps was because it regained some memories of the Soul King or if it was evolving. Pernida then launches arrows at him. Kurotsuchi dodges it, but it reverses midair, leaving him no time to react. That's when Nimue abruptly appears and grabs the nerve-manipulating arrow with her bare hand, quickly ripping it off and falling towards the ground swarming with Pernida's nerves. Kurotsuchi saves her and starts scolding her for acting on her own despite not being ordered to save him. Ever since Ichigo and the others arrived, Nimue had evolved exponentially, and it would be almost impossible for Kurotsuchi to replicate that within another one of his creations, which is why he orders her not to die unless he asks of her. However, at that time, all Nimue could think of was what he called her the first time she opened her eyes, number 7. Nimue then gives Kurotsuchi a Hajikuzai so he could restore his arm after noticing he had forgotten to pack one. Kurotsuchi then carries out his plan to take out Pernida, which involves him spraying an anesthetic all around that will paralyze Pernida for the time being, although it affects him somewhat as well. But that was a calculated risk. After that, the responsibility was in Nimue's hands, since she was tasked with injecting Pernida with a concoction that would coagulate the blood running through him and kill him. Kurotsuchi clears the path for her by paralyzing the nerves as planned, and Nimue successfully manages to inject Pernida with a shot as well. It starts working, and 2 of Pernida's arms quickly erode. But before he snaps off the connection to them, it reaches him too. He then taunts Kurotsuchi for thinking that was enough to kill him, but does so in an unusual manner, which Kurotsuchi believes was something he picked up from Kenpachi. He concludes that he was able to absorb the abilities of those he controlled and was now too quick for Nimue to react to, although Pernida's attention was on him, not Nimue. In a glimpse of the past, we see a little Nimue asking Aiken why Kurotsuchi had stopped calling her Nimuri number 7. Nimue was the 7th edition of Kurotsuchi's plan to create the first functioning artificial soul. Prior to her, all other models had died very early in their development, with number 6 lasting the longest, which was 2 years. However, Nimue changed that, naming her Nimuri, which means sleep in Japanese. Since you can't dream while being awake, she was the living, breathing dream of Kurotsuchi Mayuri, but she couldn't understand why he wouldn't call her by her original name anymore. How would he, when she was his greatest and dearest creation after all? Nimue, pushing her limits by enhancing her being's powers to just 0.8% before breakdown, leaps towards Kurotsuchi, saving him at the last second from Pernida. He again starts scolding her for acting without clear instructions, but Nimue tells him it was her mission. She then leaves him there to go back and fight Pernida again, determined to defeat him. Kurotsuchi can't help but be impressed by her as she sacrifices 6% of her soul to fire a devastating Jiken Jurinju at Pernida, obliterating him in the process. As she falls after her exhausting attack, Pernida suddenly impales her entire body with nerves, spontaneously blasting her to bits immediately. Watching his best creation expire in front of his eyes sends Kurotsuchi into a state he hadn't experienced before. A subconsciously created Shale Aparo then appears, calling Kurotsuchi out for feeling dejected now all of a sudden when his imperfect creation had died. Claiming failure was just a means to improve even further, Aporo throws Kurotsuchi's words back at him since he was starting to think that Nimue was perfect despite her imperfections. This little roast session helps Kurotsuchi to open his eyes and get his focus back. He then lets Pernida devour everything left of Nimue, taking just her cerebrum back. What follows is sudden, spontaneous, uncontrollable growth within Pernida, leading towards his gruesome demise. Kurotsuchi had implanted a growth-accelerating organ in Nimue's brain, which facilitated uncontrolled growth that could only be sustained by the cerebrum. With that connection now lost, Pernida could not control that rapid growth and exploded. Kurotsuchi then collapses after one stray nerve had gotten his leg. Ikkaku and Yumichika appear and take him to the capsules where Hitsugeya and Matsumoto were recovering. The two then place him in one of the pods and Kenpachi in the other and express their deepest gratitude to Kurotsuchi for saving their captain's life. By creating an ever-evolving artificial soul, Kurotsuchi believed he had finally surpassed Urahara. Meanwhile, at the Quincy stronghold, the estranged Quincy's launch their attack against Iwatch's guards, but quickly realize that it wouldn't be as simple as they thought. As Hashwolf is sending some of his guards to keep an eye on Ishida, they get taken out by Bazard, who tells him he should be more concerned about how he was still alive instead. Episode 11 starts off with a peek into Kyoraku's past, where we see him at his brother's house. His brother's wife gives his brother one of her hairpins, so he would always be reminded of her whenever he's far away as well, making him blush. Kyoraku can't control his smile over this drastic change in his brother, which he credits his wife for. Presently, as he's trying to tell Ohana something, a beam of destructive green light suddenly bursts through his abdomen. Boro then turns up again, still alive despite having his head blown off. He then changes his appearance into an owl-like creature, while his wings turn a lustrous gold. Proclaiming no mere Soul Reaper's Bankai was worthy of slaying him, Boro announces he will punish sinners who dared to get in his way as he unleashes the destructive power of the Light of Judgment. Kyoraku somehow manages to escape from its devastation despite the gaping wound in his stomach. His organs fried and having lost tons of blood, Kyoraku starts slipping out of consciousness. Suddenly, he hears his sister-in-law's voice asking him to wake up. It turns out to be Nanao, who then asks him to forget about the promise he had made to her mother in the past and hand over her Zanpakuto. Boro spots them, but Kyoraku blinds him by calling forth Okayo. He then tells her he will return her Zanpakuto to her. This confuses Nanao, who starts wondering if Okayo was her Zanpakuto. Simultaneously, Boro inflates his head into a flattened sphere and figures out that they were hiding in his shadow using Keijoni. Boro lights up the area, eradicating the shadow to force them out, and Nanao slips out, holding a concealed sword. At the request of her mother, Kyoraku had Ohana give birth to Okayo so she could hide her Zanpakuto. Nanao inquires why her mother asked him such a thing, upon which Kyoraku gives her a little history lesson on the Ai's family. Nanao's heritage. In the Ai's family, for some unknown reason, which was thought to be a curse, the men always seemed to die at an early age. Nanao's mother had left her family to escape that fate and had married Kyoraku's older brother. She had really changed his brother, resulting in Kyoraku spending more time at his place. Unfortunately, his brother also became ill and died some time later, and Nanao's mother was forced to return back to her family, as such was noble family tradition. Before leaving, she had entrusted Kyoraku to hide the sword away, so she could at least protect Nanao from it. Kyoraku thus had Okayo hide it. Nanao asks him to give the sword to her, demonstrating her conviction and taking comfort in the fact that she had her captain by her side too. The Ai's family were priests, with only the head possessing a Zanpakuto that was passed down generations. Although it had no blade, this particular Zanpakuto, called Shinken Hakaioken, had the ability to confront gods and reflect their powers, which is the same reason why Boro was unable to see anything in the sword's immediate vicinity, as it was reflecting his bright godly light back at him. Nanao had seen Kyoraku at the academy wearing similar kimonos as her mother, but the hairpin was a dead giveaway of her late mother's. Unable to wield a Zanpakuto, Nanao had decided to go for the Kaido Corps because she had affinity for it, but somehow still ended in Squad 8. which was being led by Kyoraku. That's when she realized he was the man who made that promise to her mother. Nanao charges Baro with her new weapon, confident that no weapon could hurt him. Baro lets her have a clean go at him, but Nanao only manages to cut his hand. Baro realizes quickly this was no ordinary weapon and starts preparing an all-out attack to finish things. While being deflected after her initial attack, Nanao had suffered cuts on both her legs, which were starting to bleed profusely now, putting her through unbearable pain. The pain and fear of facing off against a deity-like being was about to get the better of her when Kyoraku appeared behind her all of a sudden and placed his hand on her sword, easing her stress. Kyoraku, who had been entrusted with Nanao by his late brother and his sister-in-law, had come to support her one more time. Baro notices Kyoraku and calls him a coward for shielding himself behind his subordinate. Kyoraku tells Nanao that he had her back, as he always had in the past too, giving her the strength she needed now to face Baro. Baro unleashes his devastating trumpet on them, but finds himself sliced in half right away. It was the power of the Shinken Hakioken that reflected his own attack back at him. Baro bursts into brilliant gold dust, with his death a certainty this time. Nanao slips off her own blood, but thankfully Kyoraku catches her and praises her for a job well done. He then tells her they should head back and regroup, but can barely walk a couple of his steps before collapsing himself, which leads to him deciding to rejoin after they've rested a bit first.